Hello and welcome to this online course offering a condensed introduction to post-Marxist political economy. I am Mikko Poutanen, a postdoctoral researcher in political science at Tampere University here in Finland. My current research interests revolve around the political economy of higher education in the Nordics and in general, and this will also be related to the discussion on the political economy of the welfare state in this lecture. This course is created by the Academy of Finland funded project Assembling Post-Capitalist International Political Economy, located here at Tampere University. This video lecture is supported by additional content made available to you on the course platform. Feel free to pause the video or go back if you need to check something, and there also will be a list of useful links at the end of the lecture. So, this introduction to post-Marxist political economy covers many authors after Marx and Engels, typically mostly in the 20th century, who were thinkers who have reflected on the various facets of Marxism. Post-Marxist political economy revolves specifically around the post-First World War problems of realizing socialist regimes and the failure of the promised socialist revolutions that were expected by many leftist movements. Post-Marxist research has more variety, and there are found in many critical social sciences retaining the essence of original Marxist critique. Marx's original theory would need to be reapplied in two very different contexts: the Soviet forms of Marxism, in other words Marxist-Leninism, and post-Marxism in the context of the states more or less committed to free markets in Western Europe. This is a simplification, of course, because there was variety in post-Marxist theory in Eastern Europe and a great deal of variety within capitalism in Western Europe. French capitalism was not the same as the one in the Nordic states. Post-Marxists had to come to terms with the stark reality of Marxism appropriated as Stalinist Soviet authoritarianism and the failure of socialist revolutions to take hold in Western Europe. The Italian post-Marxist Antonio Gramsci argued that socialist revolutions failed because capitalism has hegemonic social power. It is common sense, in other words. Hegemony through coercion would risk resistance, but capitalist hegemony is maintained by ideology and discursive power. Post-Marxist thinking tackles with the nature of capitalism, the role of social democracy and welfare state as capitalist compromises, and the formation of new global structures of economic governance. Key dimensions of Marxism retained in post-Marxist literature include the conflict and antagonism between capital and work, and economy and society. In other words, the concept of social classes and the class struggle, as well as the exploitation inherent to capitalist social relations, remains in post-Marxism. Importantly, however, the political determinism of the inevitability of the socialist revolution was cast more in doubt. Many post-Marxists in the Nordics believed that the welfare state could only be a temporary solution because sooner or later capitalism would overcome it. As such, for them, socialist governance is the only real alternative. Post-Marxist international political economy has largely operated in a bipolar world with the United States-centric capitalism and Soviet communism at the opposite ends. Both were considered a threat to mass democratic aspirations. These economic and political blocs left little theoretical room to maneuver, but also little in the way of practical opportunities. Post-Marxists would have ideological opponents both in the communist bloc and in their own capitalist societies, because both engaged in imperialist and neo-colonial policies, which post-Marxists broadly criticized. Post-Marxism positions itself politically firmly on the left. However, in many cases, post-Marxists had to contend with both practical, political, and ideological competition from what they perceived as the center-left, being the Social Democrats. From a post-Marxist perspective, the Social Democrats sold out the potential for societal revolution in favor of a reform of the capitalist system with more social protections. Extensive social policies became embedded within capitalism, especially in the case of welfare states. The autocratic communist bloc lent credence to the interpretation that capitalism and democracy are intertwined, whereas socialism was equated with repressive political regimes. The welfare state could, in its own context, be understood as a compromise between free market capitalism and socialism, featuring heavily regulated markets and state-led welfare policies in education, healthcare, and in public policy in general. This meant that the state would set heavy boundaries on the economy and play an important role not only in setting economic policy, but also acting as an active economic player itself. Again, post-Marxists would argue that this state of balancing powers would only last until capitalism could change the balance of power in its favor. The welfare state should then be understood as a variety of capitalism, visualized here as a bridge between free markets and socialism. In this image, the welfare state is visualized as the bridge between the opposite ends of the free market on one hand and socialism on the other, also here illustrated in their appropriate colors of socialism being in the red. A political convenient compromise with labor also meant a compromise with trade unions, which accepted political power and social policies in exchange for dropping more radical socialist goals. The market economy could be regulated and directed by the state, but post-Marxist critique would point out the struggle between capital and labor remained in the background, also within this compromise. After a crisis of capital in the 1970s, the capitalist West started to reform the rules of the markets, opting for increased liberalization of the market and capital regulations. The state was slowly pushed to give more room for the perceived efficiency of the markets. As such, even before the fall of the Soviet Union, a more liberal direction of political economy had taken hold in the West. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the so-called end of history, meaning the end of the great ideological divide between socialism and capitalism, and associated financial crises made capitalist reforms seem necessary in many countries. The compromise of the welfare state, under the pressure of capital and without a power political left, eroded the power of labor and gave free rein to capital, especially in the context of a globalized world economy. This is of fundamental interest to the post-1990s, post-Marxist international political economy. Looking back at Gramsci, the hegemony of capitalism was thus solidified. This shift is often referred to as neoliberalism. We should acknowledge, however, that neoliberalism is highly disputed as a term and as policy, and many proponents of classical order of liberal political economy see it as a straw man argument. Neoliberalism basically means that the state is actively producing and reproducing markets as state policy. The neoliberal state, in other words, surrenders its public sector to capital accumulation. This applies specifically to healthcare and education services. It does not mean the disappearance of the state from the economy entirely. The pace and intensity of change to neoliberal order varies in pace, intensity, and style between national and institutional contexts. There is no single neoliberal idea, but there are common trends. The erosion of the leftist politics led to the reformulation of the socio-political welfare state compromise. In power political terms, with no viable left alternative, there was no need for free markets to compromise anymore, and the welfare state itself became represented as the other end of the spectrum. Economic liberalization now functions as a rather one-sided bridge from the welfare state to neoliberalism. Using the same visualization as before, we can look at this as the welfare state replacing socialism from the other end of the spectrum, and then welfare state retrenchment and reform becoming the bridge between free markets and the welfare states. This means that the balance of power has shifted to the right. So, national labor power became increasingly disempowered in a world of globalized labor pools available. Without leftist political power and logic, the welfare state seems to be difficult to maintain and easier to roll back. Ideologically speaking, the deregulation of the 1970s and the collapse of the communist political economy in the 1990s saw the reformation of political democratic parties seeking a new role in the globalized era as so-called third way. Practically, this meant another centrist compromise. From the perspective of post-Marxist international political economy, this was a desperate attempt to reorient social democratic parties as so-called effective and responsible economic managers and to capture more middle-class votes through deregulation, financial speculation, and global trade, increasing Western wealth. A new idea of socio-economic reality, particularly in the West, was encapsulated by the term knowledge economy, which would signal a transition from manufacture to high technology industry while maintaining global value chains and ensuring Western or Northern Global North economic dominance, even as manufacture was outsourced and offshored to the developing world. Deindustrialization was the process that disempowered much of the traditional working class in the global north and the west. For states, economic responsibility became a more, or rather a core political argument nationally and transnationally. Institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, but also the OECD, determine economic policy transnationally. This led to the depoliticization of economic policy. The economy became something that politics shouldn't interfere in, or politicians for that matter. The United States acts as the market hegemon in the current system and the so-called winner of the conflict of ideologies. Critics point out that as the holder of the global reserve currency, meaning the US dollar, the US can bend the rules that constrain others in terms of international trade and fiscal policy. This means that the global system of free trade is not, in fact, equal. With market power increasing, post-Marxist international political economy poses a challenge to the singular dominance of the free market, which was once made famous by the phrase, "There is no alternative," by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Post-Marxist international political economy explicitly calls into question the presumed link between democracy and capitalism and maintains a more democratic system of political economy is not only possible but also necessary. Post-Marxist international political economy further suggests that debt is used as a tool of creating capitalist hierarchies. Debt can be used to coerce pro-capitalist reforms in transnational contexts. Debt regimes have reduced national maneuverability in terms of debt service, for example, through currency depreciation and credit ratings. Again, these metrics and assessments appear technical, objective, and rational, but they are in fact rooted in capitalist ideology and practice. Within states, the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance tends to become a so-called super-ministry that decides responsible economic policy and protects sustainable levels of public sector expenditures, such as social policy, far into the future. Robert Cox has stated in 2004 that governments, quote, have become more effectively accountable to external bond markets than to their own publics, unquote, and that correspondingly, quote, power within the state becomes concentrated in those agencies in closest touch with the global economy, unquote, such as central banks and other ministries of finance, which subordinate other governmental branches. Another good quote, which summarizes why the welfare state became seen as too expensive to maintain, can be drawn from Andrew Martin's book from 1994. He states, quote, global trade undermines the relatively closed circuit of economic and social policy relating to high labor standards and imposes heavier burdens of social policy than it was designed to bear. From this perspective, it is true that we cannot afford the welfare state in its old form because the basis of financing it has been changed. External commitments to credible economic policy have become a key concern for the state and politicians to that effect, even while the state is declared incompetent to reform the national political economy by itself. Accordingly, the rise of neoliberalism has correlated with the decline in economic sovereignty for states and reductions in welfare provisions. The economy as a policy sector is depoliticized or moved beyond the democratic politics through a process of technocratization of closed expert authority. Neoliberal ideology prioritizes market forces in the most efficient organization of society and the affairs of the state. In other words, economic relations determine all social relations, just as was assumed in Marxist political economy. Not all critique of neoliberalism is post-Marxist, but post-Marxist international political economy at all points is critical of neoliberalism, seeking the repoliticization of the economy and the democratization of politics. Economic liberalization has in many cases been facilitated through so-called shock therapy, where crises become moments of market liberalization. This coincides with the rise of, quote, authoritarian neoliberalism, meaning authoritarian politics defending neoliberal reforms, signaling an open decoupling of the free market capitalist regime and democratic governance. From the perspective of post-Marxist international political economy, economic liberalism promotes the ideology of the survival of the fittest in the marketplace, also by reproducing it through competitive logics in the social realm, meaning social policy. While the welfare state served as a long-standing hegemonic construct in the Nordic states, in the end it might have been an anomaly of political hegemony. According to Gramsci, no hegemony is permanent. It should be noted that topics of interest to post-Marxist research have revolved around human societies and the capitalist economy. Some of the current interests include, for example, feminist and radicalized Marxism, decolonialism, imperialism and global value chains, the public sector, public goods and public commons, alternative states and alternative economies, even post-capitalism, and exceedingly also environmental concerns. Now follows an assignment for you to complete. Before taking a break to stretch your legs and maybe even taking your eyes off the screen for a moment, please read the linked BBC article on why the world is running out of sand, of all things, and consider this from the perspective of exploitation of even the most basic resources for the purposes of mass production. The lecture will next proceed with two examples: the new political economy of higher education under academic capitalism and the paradigm of knowledge economies in global competition, and the spread of surveillance capitalism.